So indeed, personal information leakage by abusing the GDPR right of access. Without further ado, let's get straight into it because there are a lot of things to talk about. So the General Data Protection Regulation is actually a European framework that came into effect since May 2018. And it's primarily meant for European consumers and businesses. But although it's not dependent on the citizenship of the consumer. Because it came into effect, I think it's more than a year ago right now, it generated a lot of startups, which they think they can provide a one-size-fits-all solution to be GDPR compliant. But as we will show you later in the talk, that's often not the case. An important thing of the GDPR is that it actually has a substantial monetary penalty. So in the worst case, if you're not GDPR compliant, you may pay up to 2 million euros or 4% of the yearly turnover. So part of that European framework, you have the right of access. Now, the right of access is a specific article in the GDPR that actually permits subjects to request all their personal information from any given organization. So that means, like, let's say I would like my data from Netflix. So I say, like, hey, Netflix. So I send an email through just by an email client, and I say, like, hey, Netflix, I would require all my data, and you have to provide it to me for free and within a month, with some exceptional cases 3 months. And you can use your data with any goal to any purpose you want. In our paper, we call this a data request, but previous works also call it subject access request. So our resource questions, what we are going to do is we are actually going to send data requests under the right of access. So the first question we have is, what information is requested by the organization to verify the identity of the consumer? So that means, like, let's say I send an email to Netflix requesting my data. What kind of credentials are they going to ask me to verify that it's really me that is asking that data? Next, how is the requested information verified by the organization? So that means, let's say they ask for an ID card. Like, how are they going to prove that this ID card is real? The next question, which is primarily the main topic of this talk today, can the requested information be forged by an adversary? Or can the organization be persuaded through social engineering to obtain personal information from someone else? So let's say I would like to get data of one of my friends or one of my rivals. Can I actually get that data by using data requests? And finally, as we will show later in this talk, there are a lot of problems with these GDPR implementations. So how can we improve the identity verification? Now, so how are we going to answer these questions? So first of all, we're going to impersonate 2 targeted individuals as an adversary in order to obtain their personal data by falsifying or forging these data requests. So these 2 individuals are actually 2 authors. So that's my colleague and me. And what we did is we contacted 55 organizations, primarily based on the Alexa Top 50, which is just a list of websites based on internet traffic. And we did that independently of each other. Then, as we do not want to shame the organizations that were vulnerable, we are going to classify each organization in categories, more specifically financial, retail, newsletters, and so forth. So what credentials are really being asked or verified by the organization? So we contacted all these organizations, and they often require a combination of the following credentials. So first of all, you have login credentials. So what does that mean? Actually, for example, Google and Facebook have a similar process where they just require you to log in on the platform just with your regular username and password, and then you will have to click a button and you get all your data within a couple of hours. So that's the usual, I mean, it's not the most common way to do it, but it's the suggested way to do it. Next, we have email address ownership. So that means that if they allow you to ask your personal data by email, they will just say, like, hey, okay, you can only send an email, only send a request with an email address that is known to us beforehand. So when you are signing up for an account, you usually have to provide an email address. So you can only send a request with that specific email address. The next thing is actually the ID card. So some companies think it's a good idea to just ask for an ID card so they can prove that it's really you that is asking the data. Next, we have the home address. So some companies also think that that only the person that is asking the data can know where you live or in which city you live. Next thing is calling the subject. So that means that they will call you to a phone number that is known to them beforehand, probably also through the sign-up page beforehand. And that is often done in combination by asking for specific user data. So that means that, for example, if you are contacting an insurance company, they might ask you for an invoice number or your last product that you have bought. So now, can we forge or falsify or maybe extract the requested credentials? So first of all, email address. It's a very old concept in phishing. It's like phishing 101 back in the 90s. You just create a similar looking email address than the original one. So let's say we have mariano.dimartino@yahoo.com, and let's say I changed, or at least I modify the I with an L. So I'm not sure if the people quite far at the end of the room can really see the difference. So another example is mariano.dimartino@gmail.com, and we just bought the domain name Gmail, where the I is like an I with a small line in it. In French, it's called an accent aigu. So that's really difficult to see in some email clients. So the home address, so like I said before, some organizations ask you for the home address or the city in which you live. Of course, that is most often public information that you can find on social media. You just Google a bit. You can find it through all sorts of open source intelligence. Or what you also can do is you can just watch the neighbor next to you and write down the city in which he lives, because it's written on the name card, obviously. Next, ID card. So in theory, we could actually take a picture of our own ID and Photoshop the name, the date of birth, and the portrait photo of the individual. And we could then censor everything else. So most companies rarely require you to provide your national register number or your passport ID number. So you can just censor it, because it's possible in theory. But in practice, that's also what we did, actually. So we actually forged the ID card. Well, not forged, Photoshop, I should say. The name is Do John. So let's say our individual is called Do John, and I just took a picture. I Photoshopped the name on and the date of birth. And then I also took a picture from social media, and I Photoshopped it on the ID. I have to say, so we censored the card ID number, although we did not censor the eyes on the photo, because we didn't want to get victimized ourselves by SOUPS attendees. So, but at the original request, we actually did not censor the eyes. So. Now, there are a couple of credentials that they have asked, but sometimes they really ask good credentials, so things we cannot forge or extract from somewhere. So we have to resort to other things, for example, by using social engineering techniques. One example is some organizations say like, hey, please send a request with an email address that is known to us beforehand. So what an adversary could say is like, yeah, sorry, I lost access to my account due to hackers. This is the reason why I'm sending this data request, just make up an excuse. So we had 5 organizations that actually said a similar thing, and it only worked on one of them. Although you might think like, hey, that's only 1 out of 5, but still like one company that leaks your personal information is already bad enough. Another organizations are like, hey, we send your personal data to an email address that is known to us. So that means that they actually verified your identity, but they're not quite sure, so they're just going to send the personal data to an email address that is known to them. So what we did is we just wait until a few days before the deadline, and then we said like, hey, we didn't receive a response to the original data request, and the deadline is almost passed, so you don't want to be GDPR incompliant, so please send us the data. It kind of worked in 1 out of the 2 organizations. Next, the final one, important one, is please send your proof A, B, and C to verify your identity. So in fact, if they ask you for 3 proofs, in fact, what we did is we just wait until a few days, and then we say like, okay, here's proof A and C. And it worked for 2 out of the 2 companies. So the overall strategy here is just a lot of pressure and a lot of legal talk, even though that often doesn't make any sense at all what we're saying. So from 55 organizations, from 55 organizations, there were 37 that accepted manual data requests. So that means that we could just send an email, and we could get a response through that same email. 14 of them didn't, 14 of them provide an online platform. So like I said, they just require regular username and password, for example, like Facebook or Google or all the major companies do. And 4 didn't answer at all, so they're not at all GDPR compliant. Now, of these 37 organizations, there were 12 that actually leaked the personal data of the individual. So we could actually leak so we actually got the data from 12 companies from the individual, and the falsified credentials were never questioned. There was no company that actually said like, hey, that ID looks fake, because it looks very real actually. So 3 out of 37 organizations also leaked personal data of someone else. So we asked the data of individual A, but we got actually data from other persons that had similar names or that something went wrong. It's a very interesting case here, but I hope I can say it if my time permits it. So the results, the leaked data that we actually got from these organizations vary widely. For example, for the financial, we actually have timestamped financial transactions or account numbers or the services that we have bought at insurance companies, for example. Another example is the serial numbers of products, the delivery dates. It's very funny here because some companies ask you to provide the serial numbers of the products. So that means that if we could just get it from one company, we could just piggyback it and use that data to falsify even more data requests. Entertainment, similar things, profile preferences, products bought. For the transport and logistics, we even received timestamped GPS locations. So we could know where the adversary went, where the individual went, the saved routes, the purchase tickets, the customer's ID, and so forth. With the news outlet, we actually even received browsing history, so which device was the victim using, which operating system, and also which profile preferences. So recommendations, actually, I would like to point out, I would like to emphasize that it's not the GDPR's fault that these organizations have badly implemented policies. Also, consumers can't really do much about it. They just have to do some kind of basic hygiene. For example, just don't show all the pictures for public. Let me emphasize that. Don't show all the pictures on social media if you're not friends with the person, for example, or just hide your date of birth. I'm sure a lot of you really show the date of birth on their social media account. Organizations, so that's really the problem here because the GDPR actually suggests you to have a platform where you can log in with your regular username and password, and also significantly reduces the risk. Another thing we recommend is to strictly verify the ownership of the email address. So that means that even though you have, or an adversary has made a similar looking email address, you might still check it really letter per letter, just character per character, so that's really sure that it's the same email address. Another thing that we suggest is to call the subject and request specific user data. So an adversary usually does not have knowledge about the invoice number from a certain victim. Another thing, please don't ask IDs. Like as we have shown a couple of slides before, we can easily Photoshop them, so please don't do that. Really quick, the ethics. So I have to say this from my colleague who works at the law department of University of Hasselt. We actually got written permission from the target individuals, so don't worry, from the ethical research committee as well. All the vulnerable organizations were notified of our research and our recommendations. Of course, in our paper, all the organizations are anonymized and classified in different categories. And finally, all the organizations responded positively. So 3 of them even requested a meeting at the university itself to discuss the recommendations, and we were happy to receive them. So that leaves me a couple of minutes. So an interesting case is where we actually got data from someone else. So let's say our targeted individual is called Leigh Johnson, and we received the data of another individual who is called Leslie John, an address on Sonar Street, number 15. So it's probably some very bad SQL query that was made, and that made this Leigh Johnson, actually. So thank you very much, everyone. I'm glad to answer your questions.
Thank you. And if folks could come up to the microphones with questions, there's 2 in the middle.
I Hello.
Hi.
My name is Abraham from University of Michigan. Thank you so much for your talk. I'm wondering if you noticed there were any similarities between the companies that like would leak the wrong data, like maybe in size or type or country or anything like that?
So you mean like the type of data that got leaked?
No, if there were the type of company.
Oh, okay. So yeah, that was actually very interesting. It's also written in the paper. There were, I think we considered 5 financial organizations, and I think 3 or 4 of them actually leaked data to us, while entertainment companies barely leaked the data. So I think that's a very weird result that you get there. So if that answers your question, I hope. Great, thank you.
Hi, my name is Smriti. I'm from Syracuse University.
Hi.
And really interesting work. I had a similar question that he had, but I'm going to ask another one. More.
Okay.
So you mentioned that some of the targeted users that you sent information about, the information got leaked and you got it. What kind of future methods or research designs would you suggest to the companies so that whenever the information is given about somebody, there should be like an alternate way for them to know that, okay, their information has been disclosed by the company? Or so if they ever got to know about that their data is leaked.
Oh, okay. So indeed, there are some recommendations. I think it's the one of Amber Welch that actually says that you, for example, there are methods you can use. For example, if you request your data or someone else requests your data, you can actually provide a notification on the online platform and say like, hey, someone has requested your data. You can either cancel it or just continue it. There are a couple of recommendations that I think still from Amber Welch recommend, but I'm not sure quite which one. But there are indeed a lot of possibilities there to apply. Yeah. Thank you.
So hello, I'm Jonathan Zunger from Humu. You mentioned that you gave one of the recommendations was for companies to use their primary authentication system in order to authenticate GDPR.
Exactly. Yeah.
I noticed, however, there are several cases where a company is not likely to have a strong primary authentication, like news organizations, for example. And in these cases, they might not even have it tied to an email address in a strongly authenticated fashion. Are there any recommendations of best practices in a situation like that?
That's a very good question because we have thought about it as well. Because like you said, indeed, some news outlets do not have that information. They don't even have an email address or something like that. That's very problematic to actually verify you yourself. So there are some recommendations where you can sign specific things, like you can sign your ID card so it can be falsified. But still, it's very problematic to verify there. I don't really have any good solution for that. I think policymakers should look more into depth with that. So I'm sorry to.
This may be a very similar question. For organizations that did not have I don't know how many of the companies you tagged did not have any digital identity, those users, that they didn't have any online.
Excuse me, can you rephrase that?
So I don't know, for the examples that you quoted, if any of these companies, the users that you were like creating the false
email address
examples with,
they
did not have any digital identity at all. Meaning within you didn't exist as an identity within that particular company's systems.
I'm sure I don't quite understand your question.
Yeah, so my question is for the companies that you are targeting with your examples, did they actually have a login system that you could log into, and you did not exist over there?
Oh, so you mean the organizations that were vulnerable, or?
Yeah.
No. So actually, the data that got leaked was never from an organization that require regular login credentials. So we actually, I think it was 14, I think. So of these 14, we actually requested the data, but we didn't got any data from someone else or other leaked data. So.
Okay. So there was never any online request system. This was all through calling them or manually doing this.
So in the 37 that were there, so I've quickly back. So the 37 actually accepted manual data requests. So they did not require any login credentials.
Login credentials.
Okay. Did that answer this question?
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
So hi, my name is Kevin from Lyft. One of your recommendations was that organizations should use their existing authentication mechanisms to authenticate subject access requests. Have you thought about at all the challenge of minimizing the risk of account takeover? So if we assume that the account has already been taken over, then what can organizations do to minimize the risk posed by the data in the data subject access request? Yeah, so if I understand correctly, you mean that if someone has taken over your account, they can just easily request your personal data, right? Yeah, so we haven't really thought about that. The fact is, even for like simple account logins, there are indeed a lot of organizations that provide two-factor authentication. So that may be required, of course, but I'm not quite sure if that's. I mean, you could of course apply two-factor authentication, but that means that the consumer has to provide some way of other identification, either through Google Authenticator or SMS or something. But yeah, that would be a good idea. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I think we're ready for our next speaker.
Thank you.